In front of the new investors, the millionaire CEO decided to humiliate the cleaning lady, who entered the room. "Servants are not allowed in my meeting," he shouted, throwing her out like trash. He expected laughter, but what happened next was his worst nightmare. The woman ignored the order, slowly took off her gloves, walked to the head of the table, and sat in the main chair. The CEO was about to shout again, but froze instantly. The most important investor stood up, poured her a cup of coffee, and asked, "Ma'am, what shall we do with him?" The sleek, glass-walled boardroom of Titan Investments, high above Midtown Manhattan, felt like a freezer, and the air conditioning wasn't the only culprit. Pierce Sterling Jr., the CEO who had inherited not just the company, but the crushing weight of a family name he couldn't honor, felt cold sweat trail down his spine, a cruel contrast to the perfectly temperature-controlled environment. Every slide of his presentation on cost optimization and strategic synergy felt like another nail in his corporate coffin. His leadership, marked by impulsive decisions and overblown arrogance, had bled the company's capital dry, turning a solid legacy into a mountain of liabilities. This meeting with a new and promising group of investors wasn't just an opportunity. It was the last lifeline in an ocean of debt. He desperately needed the investment to reverse the imminent disaster, to prove to everyone and to himself that he was more than just the founder's son. As he stammered through profit projections and cash flow models that he didn't even believe in, the door whispered open. Beatrice Sampaio, the newly hired cleaner, slipped in, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to being overlooked. She carried a silver tray piled with empty porcelain coffee cups left by the executives. Her grey uniform, impeccably clean, was a stark contrast to the bespoke suits and Italian loafers circulating in the room. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on her task, ignoring the complex charts and the MBA jargon that filled the air. To her, this was just another workday, an honest way to earn her income and maintain her dignity. Pierce, however, saw her silent presence as an opportunity. Nervousness and pressure made him volatile, and his most primitive instinct was to find a target to vent his frustration, to project an image of control he was far from feeling. Seeing her there, so vulnerable in her simplicity, he found the perfect scapegoat. He paused dramatically mid-sentence, the sudden silence causing every head to turn. Then, with a theatrical gesture, he pointed a finger directly at Beatrice. "What is this?" His voice boomed, artificially potent, cutting the room's tension. The investors blinked, confused. "Did I not give explicit orders that no one was to enter? Support staff doesn't walk into my meeting," he shouted, every word calculated to humiliate. A fleeting, sadistic smile curved his lips as he felt momentary power inflate his chest. "Get out now! You are contaminating the environment with your presence. What kind of company is this that can't control its low-level employees? Get out of here!" The humiliation settled upon Beatrice like a heavy, cold cloak. She froze, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. The investors' faces twisted in a mixture of embarrassment and pity. The air grew thick, charged with the gratuitous cruelty of the attack. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The world waited for her to shrink, to apologize with a choked voice and flee, as anyone in that position surely would. But Beatrice did not shrink. Instead of retreating, she slowly raised her head, and for the first time, her eyes met Pierce's. There was a disconcerting calm in them, a strength he couldn't decipher. She walked with a serenity that defied the situation, not toward the door, but toward the polished mahogany conference table. With a deliberate gesture, she set the tray aside. The soft clinking of porcelain on wood was the only sound in the paralyzed room. Then, before the stunned gazes of everyone, she pulled off the yellow rubber gloves, revealing surprisingly well-manicured hands, her nails perfectly done, and, in an act of supreme defiance, she pulled out the head chair, Pierce's chair, the throne of his ephemeral power, and took a seat. Pierce's scream echoed in the silent room, a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Are you insane? Who do you think you are? Security!" Two robust men, discreetly posted near the door, stepped forward, their faces impassive, ready to carry out the order. The humiliation of being defied by a subordinate in front of the people who held his future in their hands was more than his inflated ego could bear. He had to reassert his authority, crush this insubordination before it completely undermined his already precarious position. His mind, clouded by panic, could only process the need to expel her, to erase the bizarre scene and regain control of the narrative, his presentation, his life. The capital he craved depended on this. The salvation of the family fortune was at stake. But before the security guards could take a second step, something happened that froze everyone, turning Pierce's rage into an ice that spread through his veins. Mr. Harrison, the lead investor, the man whose millions of dollars were Titan Investments' only hope, rose. He did not do so abruptly or angrily. On the contrary, he moved with a calm deliberation that commanded respect. He completely ignored Pierce's pleading, confused gaze. With measured steps, he walked to the gleaming coffee machine in the corner of the room. The only sound was the soft whir of the machine and the dark liquid filling a white porcelain cup. The other investors exchanged nervous glances, their faces a canvas of confusion. No one understood what was happening, but they all felt that the axis of the meeting had irrevocably shifted. With the steaming cup in hand, Mr. Harrison approached the table, not Pierce, but the woman seated in his chair. He placed it respectfully in front of her, the gesture so reverent it seemed more fitting for a queen than a cleaner. "Would you care for some sugar, Ms. Sampaio?" he asked, his voice low and loaded with a deference Pierce had never seen directed at anyone, much less himself. The words, "Miss Sampaio," hit Pierce like a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale as wax. The sweat, previously a mere annoyance, now beaded on his forehead in thick drops. "Ms." The formal address, the deference, the surreal scene of a multimillionaire serving coffee to a janitor. None of it made sense. A primal fear, the sense that he had made a catastrophic error, began to suffocate him. The world around him seemed to warp, the voices of the other investors fading into a distant hum. He stammered, his voice a ragged whisper. "Ms. Sampaio!" Only then did Mr. Harrison turn to him. The investor's face, previously cordial and professional, was now a mask of pure contempt. The look he cast at Pierce was not one of anger, but of disgust, as if viewing something insignificant. "Pierce, I feel I must clarify a misunderstanding," Harrison began, his voice sharp as broken glass. "I am merely the account manager for this investment fund, an employee." He paused, letting the weight of the admission settle. Then, with a clear gesture toward the woman watching everything in silence, he delivered the final blow. "This," he said, "is Beatrice Sampaio, the owner of the fund, the person you have been begging for the past several weeks to save your company." Beatrice, until then a silent spectator to her own drama, took a small sip of the coffee. The gesture was simple, mundane, but in that context, it was a demonstration of absolute power. She finally raised her eyes and fixed them directly on Pierce for the first time since sitting down. Her gaze held no anger, no triumph. It was cold, analytical, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. It was the look of someone about to make a business decision. "I always visit my potential acquisitions incognito, Pierce." Her voice was calm, steady, and cut the silence of the room like a blade. "It's the best way to discover a leader's true character." Beatrice's statement hung in the cold air, dense and heavy as a sentence. "It's the best way to discover a leader's true character." Every word was a hammer beating on the fragile structure of Pierce's reality. His brain, previously focused on charts and projections, now churned in a whirlwind of denial and panic. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a cruel trick played by his competitors, a bizarre test orchestrated by Harrison. He looked desperately at the account manager, searching for a sign, a wink that would tell him it was all staged. But Harrison's face remained a mask of icy contempt, confirming the horror of the situation. The woman in front of him, whom he had publicly humiliated, was indeed Beatrice Sampaio, a near-mythical legend in the financial market, a billionaire who built her immense fortune from the ground up. Beatrice placed the cup back on the saucer with a soft click, the sound echoing in the deathly silence. "You see, Pierce," she continued, her voice calm but with an undertone of steel, "anyone can be charming to someone who can offer them something. Anyone can memorize a speech about profits and dividends, but the true test of a leader, the real measure of their worth, is how they treat those they believe they don't need, how they treat the person who cleans their floor, who serves their coffee." She made a sweeping gesture with her hand. "I don't just invest in spreadsheets and balance sheets. That's for amateurs. I invest in character, because a flawed character, Pierce, is the greatest of all liabilities. It is a debt that, sooner or later, drives any business into bankruptcy." The other investors, until then passive spectators, began to stir. Their movements were discreet but definitive. One closed his laptop with a dry snap. Another tucked his gold pen into his inside jacket pocket. These were the rituals marking the conclusion of a deal that no longer existed. Pierce's humiliation deepened, layer by layer, as he realized he had lost not just the investment, but the respect, the credibility, the very professional dignity. Everything his father had built, the inheritance he was supposed to multiply, was dissolving before his eyes because of his stupid arrogance. He had to say something, anything to stop the bleeding. "Miss Sampaio." His voice came out as a hoarse, pathetic whisper. He stood, his legs trembling. I made a terrible mistake. Unforgivable. The pressure of this meeting. I'm not like that. Please, give me a chance. A single chance to show you are wrong about me." The plea was genuine, born of the purest desperation. He was begging for the survival of his world. Beatrice watched him for a long moment. For the first time, an emotion other than cold professional disdain seemed to flicker in her eyes. It was not pity. It was something older, deeper, a shadow of disappointment, perhaps, or the echo of past pain. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, loaded with an untold history. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, almost intimate, which made it even more devastating. "The problem, Pierce," she said, and the use of his first name now sounded like a condemnation, "is that this isn't the first time your family name's arrogance has cost someone dearly." She paused, letting the enigmatic sentence hang in the air, stabbing into Pierce's mind. "I know that better than anyone." Beatrice's enigmatic statement, "This isn't the first time your family name's arrogance has cost someone dearly," landed on Pierce like a ton of bricks. What did that mean? His family's arrogance, his father, Pierce Sterling Sr., the founder of Titan, was a hard, ruthless businessman, a true Wall Street shark who built a fortune through his cunning in the stock market, but arrogant enough to cost someone dearly. To create an enemy as powerful and patient as the woman in front of him, Pierce's mind, minutes before concerned with cash flow and profitability, now frantically searched a past he barely knew, looking for an error, an old sin that could justify this cold, calculated revenge. He had always seen his father's legacy as a set of financial assets and liabilities, a fortune in dollars and stock. It never occurred to him that there might be debts of another nature, emotional debts that the interest of time had only increased. For an instant, Beatrice's steel mask wavered. Her eyes lost focus on the boardroom and seemed to gaze at a distant point in time. Midtown disappeared, replaced by the scent of sawdust and varnish from a small workshop. She was no longer the commanding billionaire, but a girl with pigtails, watching in awe as her father's skilled hands transformed a piece of mahogany into a work of art. Her father, a broad-shouldered man with an easy smile, whose only capital was his talent and honesty, he called her his little treasure. She remembered another man, tall and imposing, in a dark suit, visiting the workshop. It was Pierce Sterling Sr., Pierce's father, on his ascent to becoming a multimillionaire. He praised her father's work, talked about a partnership, about expanding the business, about a brilliant future. He promised an investment that would transform the small carpentry shop, Sampaio Woodworks, into an exclusive supplier for his luxury developments. The promise filled their home with hope, the prospect of a more secure life, of turning the small family business into a source of lasting wealth. But the next memory was bitter. Her father's silence, his shoulders stooped with defeat, the tools being sold one by one. The promise was never kept. Worse, it was used to crush them. Pierce saw the shadow of pain cross her face and, in an act of desperation, tried to connect with that unexpected humanity. "Miss Sampaio, I swear I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice choked. "My father, he was a businessman, tough, yes, but he built this company, this fortune, with integrity. If there was any misunderstanding in the past, I implore you to let me fix it." His words sounded empty even to himself. He was offering money to fix a wound he didn't even understand, proving, unknowingly, the exact point Beatrice was making about his family. Beatrice snapped back to the present, the painful memory turning into fuel for her resolve. The coldness returned to her gaze, now tinged with ancient sadness. She rose, the fluid, decisive movement signaling that the meeting and Pierce's career were over. The mistake, Pierce, was believing that promises made to small people had any value to big men. She walked toward the door, which Mr. Harrison opened silently. The other investors were already withdrawing, avoiding Pierce's gaze, leaving him behind in his own ruin. Passing him, Beatrice stopped for a second, close enough that only he could hear. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades. "When you go to clear out your desk, look in your father's old archives. Look for a file named Sampaio Woodworks. Maybe then you will understand the true price of your legacy." The door closed with a soft click, but to Pierce, the sound was that of a vault door locking, leaving him outside his own life. He stood alone in the boardroom, a deposed king in his empty castle. The silence was overwhelming, filled only by the low hum of the projector still displaying a useless chart of future profitability. The air, previously thick with tension, now felt thin, difficult to breathe. He looked at the head chair, the chair Beatrice Sampaio had occupied, and saw it no longer as a symbol of his power, but as the witness stand of his judgment and condemnation. Everything he had worked for, or rather, everything he had received as a guaranteed inheritance, the wealth, the prestige, the family assets, had turned to dust in a matter of minutes. The collapse was not financial, at least not initially. It was a collapse of identity. Without the CEO title, without the sterling fortune to buffer him, who was he? Her words echoed in his mind, repeating in a torturous loop. "Look for a file named Sampaio Woodworks." The name meant nothing to him. In all his life, dealing with investment funds, stocks, and multi-millions, he had never heard of a simple carpentry shop. It was a detail so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of Titan's fortune, and yet it seemed to be the key to understanding the catastrophe that had swallowed him whole. Driven by an impulse that was no longer ambition, but a desperate need for comprehension, he rose. His legs felt heavy and unsteady, belonging to someone else. He left the boardroom and crossed the main floor. The outside world seemed to return suddenly. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, but everything sounded muffled, distant. The gazes of his employees followed him, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and thinly veiled fear. He was no longer the leader, he was the epicenter of a disaster, and no one wanted to get too close. He ignored them all, his destination not his luxurious office overlooking the city, but a place he rarely visited, the Dead File Archive, located in the building's sub-level storage. It was there that the ghosts of Titan Investments' past were kept, the stories behind the profits and the liabilities. As he descended the stairs to the archive, he found Ellen, his father's secretary for more than 30 years. She was watering a potted fern in the hallway, a constant maternal figure amidst the corporate turbulence. Her kind eyes, which had watched him grow up, now regarded him with profound sadness. "Mr. Pierce," she began, her voice soft. "I'm so sorry about what happened." Pierce merely nodded, unable to formulate a response. "Your father," she continued, as if reading his thoughts, "he kept everything, especially the things he didn't want to forget, or that he feared others would remember." Her observation, so casual, sent a chill down Pierce's spine. The archive was cold and smelled of dust and old paper, row after row of cardboard boxes stretched out in the gloom, a graveyard of past business dealings. Pierce began to search. His hands stained with dust, his expensive suit rumpled. He didn't know the year, he didn't know the context, just a name. Box after box, he searched, hope turning into frustration and then into silent despair. Just as he was about to give up, he saw it. In a forgotten box, from a year long before he dreamed of running the company, a thin manila folder, yellowed with age. On the label, his father's unmistakable, elegant handwriting, Sampaio Woodworks. His heart pounded. With trembling hands, he sat on the cold concrete floor, the dust swirling around him. He hesitated for a second, feeling he was about to cross a point of no return. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the folder. The first thing he saw was not a contract or a financial statement, it was a faded photograph. The photograph was faded, the colors washed out by time, transforming the vibrant scene into a ghostly echo of the past. In it, two men smiled at the camera, their arms over each other's shoulders, in a gesture of camaraderie and hope. One Pierce recognized immediately, his father, Pierce Sterling Sr., younger, his face not yet marked by the hardness of years of corporate battles, but already with the glint of ambition in his eyes. The other man was a stranger, broad-faced with hands that looked too large, calloused from work. Between them, a small girl, perhaps 7 or 8, with dark pigtails and a shy smile that barely contained her joy. She held the broad-faced man's hand with childish confidence, and then the air fled Pierce's lungs. In that shy smile, in those deep, dark eyes, he saw, unequivocally, the fierce intelligence of the woman who had just destroyed his world. It was Beatrice. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he set the photo aside and plunged into the documents in the folder. What he found was the history of a dream, told on yellowed paper. There was a meticulously detailed business plan for Sampaio Woodworks, with exclusive furniture designs and growth projections. There were copies of letters exchanged between his father and the other man in the photo, Antonio Sampaio. Antonio's letters overflowed with enthusiasm and gratitude for a promised investment that, he believed, would transform his small family business into a prestigious supplier, securing his daughter's future. His father's replies were more contained, full of corporate jargon about market analysis and due diligence, but always ending with a note of encouragement that kept Antonio's flame of hope alive. Then, Pierce found the draft of a partnership agreement. It was perfect, with clauses about profit sharing, capital contributions, and governance. But one thing was missing: the signatures. It was a formalized promise, but never sealed. Flipping further, the tone of the documents changed drastically. Antonio's letters became more anxious, then supplicating. He spoke of debts incurred based on the promise of investment, of suppliers who could wait no longer. Pierce Sterling Xenadu's responses became rarer, vaguer, until they ceased altogether. The last document in that section was a cold, impersonal notice of mortgage foreclosure. The woodworks, Antonio's dream, Beatrice's future. Everything had been lost, but it was the final piece of paper at the bottom of the folder that broke something inside Pierce. It was a sheet from a notebook, folded and refolded, the blue ink faded in places, stained by what could only be tears. It was a final, handwritten letter from Antonio to his father. The handwriting was shaky, that of a broken man. "Pierce," the letter began, without any formality. "I trusted you. You came to my house, ate at my table, praised my work. You made my daughter smile and believe her father could build a castle. Based on your word, I took a risk, and you disappeared. Why, Pierce? I no longer ask for the money. I just want to understand. You broke more than a promise. You broke my spirit." Pierce sat there, on the cold, dusty archive floor, his family's legacy crumbling in his hands. The immense fortune, the stock wealth, the assets he had always seen as proof of his father's genius, now seemed stained, built upon the ruin of a good man. The arrogance he displayed in the boardroom was not his own fault, it was an inheritance. He had not only inherited his father's money, he had also inherited his sins. Was this the true debt Titan Investments carried? A moral liability, unpayable, whose interest had just been called in all at once? The weight of the revelation crushed Pierce. He reread Antonio's letter several times, each word a blow to his conscience. The image of his father, the business titan he had always idolized, dissolved, replaced by that of a cruelly calculating man who used another's hope as a stepping stone for his own ascent. The arrogance he had exhibited with Beatrice was not a momentary lapse, but the echo of learned behavior, a toxic inheritance he had perpetuated without even realizing it. Sitting on the archive floor, surrounded by the paper ghosts of the past, he felt naked, stripped not just of his position and imminent fortune, but of his very identity. Who was he, but the distorted reflection of his father? What had he built on his own merit? The answer was a terrifying void. He remained there for a time he couldn't measure. The buzz of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. Finally, moved by an impulse that was no longer desperation but something new, a spark of responsibility, he rose. He tucked the folder under his arm with an almost reverent care, as if it contained not old papers, but the remnants of a life. He had to do something. Apologizing to Beatrice seemed a futile gesture, like trying to put out a fire with a cup of water. Offering her money would be an even greater insult. No, the only possible reparation required more than words or capital. It required action. It required sacrifice. With the folder under his arm, he climbed the stairs, ignoring the curious glances. He went not to his luxurious office, but to Ellen's small workspace. The secretary looked at him with her wise eyes, noting the change in his posture. He no longer looked like a defeated CEO, but a man with a grim purpose. "Ellen," he said, his voice steady for the first time that day, "I need your help. I need you to call an emergency meeting with all department heads and, if possible, the remaining board members, as quickly as possible." Ellen, who had served 2 Sterlings, saw something in Pierce's eyes she had never seen in his father's, the shadow of remorse. She nodded, without asking questions, and began making the calls. 2 hours later, the same boardroom that had been the stage for his humiliation was full again. The executives' faces were a mix of anxiety and apprehension. Everyone knew about the disaster with the investors. Rumors swept the hallways like wildfire. They expected an announcement of mass layoffs, a declaration of bankruptcy, the end of Titan. Pierce entered the room, but did not go to the head chair. He remained standing at the end of the table, the Sampaio Woodworks folder in his hands. He waited for the silence to settle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and unwavering, "I called you here to announce my resignation as CEO of Titan Investments, effective immediately." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. The resignation was expected, but the frankness and speed of the announcement were not. "But that is not the most important thing," he continued, opening the folder on the table. "The most important thing is for you to know the true foundation upon which this company was built." And then he told the story. He read Antonio's letters, showed the faded photograph, exposed the unsigned contract, and the final plea. He did not spare his father, and he did not spare himself. "The arrogance that led me to commit today's unforgivable mistake was not born with me. It was cultivated in this company, watered by a culture that values profit above people, a culture that allowed my father to destroy a good man for a marginal gain and then forget him in a dusty archive." He paused, looking into the eyes of every person in the room. "Beatrice Sampaio taught us a lesson today, and I will not allow it to be in vain. Titan, as we know it, is over, but perhaps from its ashes something better can be born." Then he did something no one, not even he, could have predicted. He took out his solid gold lighter, a gift from his father. With a click, he lit the flame and, before the horrified eyes of everyone, set fire to the framed copy of the original incorporation agreement that founded Titan's fortune, an iconic document that hung on the wall. The fire alarm blared, strident, as the flames began to lick the paper that symbolized the origin of all his wealth and all his ruin. The fire alarm screamed, a sharp, incessant sound that seemed to tear the fabric of reality. Almost instantly, the sprinklers on the ceiling came alive, dumping a torrent of icy water onto the boardroom. The water hissed as it hit the small flames, licking the historic document, extinguishing the fire in seconds and replacing the smell of smoke with the acrid odor of wet carpet and burned paper. The executives, previously paralyzed by shock, now moved in panic, shielding their expensive suits and leather briefcases from the dirty water pouring down. The scene was chaotic, a forced baptism that washed away the arrogance and luxury of that sacred business environment. Amidst it all, Pierce remained motionless, the water soaking his hair and running down his face, mixing with silent tears he didn't even realize were falling. He didn't feel cold. For the first time in his life, he felt a strange, painful sense of lightness, as if the weight of his family's dishonest fortune was being washed from his shoulders. The security guards, who'd been called earlier to remove Beatrice, now rushed in, their faces strained, expecting a major fire. Instead, they found their CEO, the man who paid their salaries, standing under the artificial deluge, a gold lighter in his hand and the charred remnants of the company symbol at his feet. The confusion on their faces was total. Ellen, however, acted with the calm of someone who had seen far worse crises. "Everyone out, in order!" Her firm voice cut through the panic, guiding the stunned executives toward the emergency exits. Her last glance was at Pierce, and there was no condemnation in it, only a deep, unfathomable sadness. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Beatrice Sampaio sat in the back of her luxury car, a refuge of silence and soft leather. The chaos at Titan Investments was already a diminishing point in the rearview mirror. Beside her, Mr. Harrison reviewed the first market movements on his tablet. News that her fund had withdrawn interest in the investment was already leaking, and Titan's stock was beginning the freefall they had predicted. The revenge was underway, precise and cold as an algorithm. The plan was simple: wait for the company's value to turn to dust and, on Monday, acquire the remaining assets, the net worth, for a fraction of their real value, completing the annihilation of Pierce Sterling Sr. D's legacy. Then, Harrison's personal phone vibrated. It was a call from one of his high-level contacts inside Titan. Harrison answered, his expression professional, But as he listened, his eyes widened, his mouth dropped slightly. He muttered, "Yes, I see. He did what?" With each new piece of information. When he hung up, he turned to Beatrice, who watched him with an arched eyebrow. "Mr. Sampaio," he said, his voice a tone higher than normal. "Something unexpected has happened." He then reported everything. Pierce's resignation, the public confession about his father's history and the woodworks, and the final act of burning the company's founding document. Beatrice listened in silence, her face as impassive as ever. But inside, a silent earthquake shook the foundations of her resolve. This was not part of the script. Her revenge was against an arrogant Sterling, a spoiled heir who perpetuated his father's cruelty. But this act of public self-destruction, of destroying his own legacy, was something she couldn't process. Was it genuine, or was it merely the most elaborate and desperate of manipulations? The plan for the acquisition on Monday still stands, correct? Harrison asked, seeking reassurance from his leader. Beatrice did not reply immediately. She looked out the window at the skyscrapers of Midtown that gleamed like monuments to power and money. The power she now held, the money she had used as a weapon for the first time in decades. She felt a pang of uncertainty. Continuing with the plan now felt different. It was no longer the execution of an enemy. It was kicking a man who was already on the ground, a man who, in a distorted and shocking way, seemed to be trying to repair a wrong that was not his own. "No," she finally said, her voice so low Harrison had to lean in to hear. "The plan has changed." "Changed, Mom. How?" he asked, confused. Beatrice turned to him, and in her eyes, for the first time, the coldness of steel was replaced by a dangerous, complex flame of curiosity. "Get me his personal number. I'll call him myself." Pierce's walk out of the Titan Investments building was the longest and loneliest of his life. Soaked, trembling under the shocked gaze of hundreds of employees, he was no longer the CEO, the heir to a great fortune. He was a pariah, the architect of his own spectacular fall. No one dared approach him. He crossed the marble lobby, leaving a trail of dirty water on the polished floor that had always been the symbol of his family's impeccable success. Pushing open the glass doors and stepping out into the damp city air, he felt as if he were emerging from a submerged tomb. He didn't take his luxury car with the driver. He simply started walking aimlessly, the sound of the city muffled by the storm raging inside his head. Every step took him further from a world of wealth, assets, a net worth that now seemed absurdly irrelevant. He didn't care about the money that would be lost, the ruin of the family business. The only thing occupying his mind was the smiling face of a girl in a faded photograph and the shaky handwriting of a good man in his last letter. Hours later, he sat in the gloom of his penthouse apartment. The city stretched out below him, a glittering sea of lights, but for the first time, the view brought him no sense of power or belonging. It was just a reminder of how high he was and how hard the fall would be. His cell phone vibrated incessantly on the coffee table, illuminating the darkness with the names of lawyers, board members, and panicked friends. He ignored them all. What could he say to them? That he had traded a multi-million-dollar empire for a glimpse of his own soul? They wouldn't understand. He barely understood himself. He only knew that the moment the flames consumed that paper, he had done the first truly authentic thing in his entire life. Then, the phone rang differently. A blocked, unknown number. For some reason, he felt he should answer. Perhaps it was the final nail in his coffin, the ultimate call to inform him of the total extent of the damage. He answered, his voice a hoarse murmur. "Hello?" A silence on the other end, so profound he could hear controlled breathing. And then, the voice that had haunted his day, Pierce Sterling. It was her, Beatrice. The voice was no longer sharp as in the boardroom. It was calm, analytical, and that was even more terrifying. Pierce straightened, his body tense. Yes, I heard about what you did, she said, without preamble. The show in the boardroom, the resignation, the fire. It was quite dramatic. There was a pause. Tell me, what was the objective? To gain the market's pity? A desperate attempt to salvage some fragment of your assets before everything was lost? The question was a knife, testing him, searching for the old arrogance, the selfish calculation she expected to find. But Pierce no longer had any of that left inside him. No, he replied, his voice surprisingly steady. There was nothing to salvage. You said it yourself. By Monday, the company would be worth pennies. It wasn't a business move. It wasn't about the capital or the stock. It was about the folder, about your father's letter. He swallowed hard. That piece of paper was worth more than everything else. It was the only part of my inheritance that mattered, and I needed to burn it. On the other end of the line, Beatrice was silent for a prolonged moment. She was in her own high-rise office, the city of Manhattan at her feet, a mirrored image of the man she was speaking to. Mr. Harrison watched her, trying to decipher his boss's unreadable expression. She had expected pleas, apologies, negotiations. She did not expect that raw confession, that acceptance of a debt that transcended money. He wasn't trying to save his wealth. He was trying to save something far more intangible. Words, she finally said, her voice still devoid of emotion. Words are cheap, Pierce. I built my fortune by learning never to trust them. I know, he replied. Resigned, I don't expect you to. Another pause, longer this time. Pierce's future, whatever was left of it, was being weighed in the balance during that silence. I want to meet you, Beatrice said suddenly, the decision made in an instant. Tomorrow, but not here, not in my world or what's left of yours. Pierce felt a shiver run down his spine. Where? I'll send you an address, she said. Be there at 10 in the morning. Alone. The line went dead, leaving Pierce in the darkness of his apartment with a new kind of fear growing in his chest. The fear of the unknown. Pierce's night was a sleepless desert, populated by the ghosts of his own actions. He didn't touch food, didn't answer the dozens of missed calls. He just sat, watching the city lights turn off one by one, feeling like the last sentinel of a ruined kingdom. In the morning, an anonymous text message arrived, containing only an address. It wasn't in Midtown, or the Upper East Side, or any other enclave of wealth he knew. It was in a working-class neighborhood, a place that existed on his map only as a gray area to be avoided. For the first time in over a decade, he did not go down to the underground garage where a driver waited. He went down to street level and, with an awkward, hesitant gesture, hailed a taxi. The trip was a literal and figurative descent. The mirrored glass skyscrapers giving way to low-rise buildings, stores with faded facades, and a tangle of wires over narrower streets. It was a world that operated on a different currency than he knew. It wasn't about stocks or compound interest, but the daily cash flow of survival. He got out on a quiet, cobblestone street. The address had led him to a parking lot, a flat plot of cracked asphalt, surrounded by a low wall, where a few modest cars were parked under the morning sun. For a moment, he thought he had the wrong place. But then he saw her. Beatrice was standing in the center of the empty lot, her back to him. She wasn't wearing the cleaner's uniform, nor the power suit of a billionaire. She wore jeans and a simple cotton top. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Without the armor of the corporate context, she looked smaller, more real. A woman standing on the scar of her own history. He approached slowly, the sound of his custom-made Italian shoes sounding profane in that silence. She turned when he was a few feet away. Her face was serene, but her eyes studied him with an intensity that stripped him bare. This was the Woodworks, she said, her voice without inflection, as if stating a geographical fact. My father bought this land with my grandmother's inheritance. Every inch of it was his dream. She looked at the asphalt ground. Now, people pay to leave their cars here for a few hours, and they don't even imagine they are parking over a man's broken heart. Pierce didn't know what to say. An apology seemed an insult to the magnitude of the loss. I read his letter, was all he could manage to murmur. I know, Beatrice said. You wouldn't be here if you hadn't read it. She walked toward him, stopping close enough that he could see the small lines of expression around her eyes. I need to understand, Pierce. Why did you come? To negotiate a settlement? To try to save some part of your assets? Because if that's why, you wasted your time. He shook his head, the gesture slow and heavy. No, I didn't come because of the money. I don't care about the fortune anymore. I came because I don't know what to do. The confession came out raw, devoid of any pride. My father left me a legacy built on this. He gestured toward the ground. It's a liability that isn't on any balance sheet. I don't know how to pay it off. Beatrice stared at him for a long time. The skepticism in her eyes fought with something new, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity about human nature. She saw the honesty in his exhaustion. He wasn't lying. He was lost. You're right, she said, her voice a little softer. You can't pay it off, not with money. She turned away, giving him her back again and looking at the horizon. My father didn't want to be a multimillionaire. He wanted to build things with his own hands. He believed that a man's true value was in what he created, not what he accumulated. She turned to him suddenly, her eyes fixed on his, the decision stamped on her face. You want to start paying this debt? You want to understand what was taken from me? Then forget investment funds and securities. Words and fire don't fix anything. She took a step forward, the challenge gleaming in her eyes. Tomorrow morning, at 6 sharp, you will start working. Not for me, not for a salary. You will work in a place I choose, a place where you will learn with your own hands. The true meaning of building something from the ground up. The morning sun had not yet climbed the buildings when Pierce arrived at the address Beatrice had sent. It was a community woodworking shop, squeezed between a warehouse and a small church. The smell of sawdust and glue hung in the air, an aroma he now associated with the history that had undone him. An older man, in dusty overalls and a face furrowed by time, waited for him at the door. His eyes, a surprisingly clear blue-y, examined Pierce up and down, noting the expensive shoes and soft hands with evident skepticism. You must be the volunteer Miss Sampaio sent, he said, his voice deep like the hum of a saw. My name is Alfonso. Around here, we don't care about last names, only the work. Alfonso guided him inside. The place was a sanctuary to wood. Planks of all kinds were stacked against the walls, and workbenches were covered with tools Pierce wouldn't know how to name. In one corner, children's chairs and unfinished cribs waited to come to life. Everything we make here, Alfonso explained, is donated to families who can't afford to buy. There's no profit, no dividends. The only revenue we receive is the satisfaction of a job well done. The mention of those terms from his old world felt like a deliberate jab. Alfonso handed him a canvas apron and pointed to a stack of pine boards. Your first task, sanding all of them until they are smooth as a baby's skin. Pierce took the piece of sandpaper and one of the boards. It seemed simple, but after 10 minutes, his shoulders ached. After 20, the friction of the paper against his skin, unaccustomed to anything rougher than a luxury pen, began to create painful friction points. His mind, trained to think in terms of profitability and cash flow, rebelled against the monotony of the task. What kind of investment was this? Hours of hard labor for a result that could not be measured in dollars or euros. He thought of his former wealth, the deals he closed, the ease with which he moved capital around the world. With one phone call, he could transact the equivalent of Alfonso's lifetime earnings. And yet, here he was, defeated by a piece of wood. Mid-morning, blisters began to form on his palms. One of them burst, and the sharp pain made him drop the sandpaper with a groan. Alfonso, who had been watching from afar, approached. He offered no sympathy. He just grabbed a small bottle of antiseptic and a clean cloth. "That happens when the hands don't know work," he said, cleaning the wound with practical efficiency. "The pain is part of the process. Either you overcome it, or it overcomes you." Pierce looked at Alfonso's hands. They were a map of decades of labor, covered in scars and calluses. They were the hands of a builder, the hands of Antonio Sampaio. In that moment, humiliation turned into something different: shame. He took the cloth, wrapped it tightly around his injured hand, and picked up the sandpaper again, silence being his only response. He worked the rest of the day driven by a stubbornness he didn't know he possessed. He ignored the pain, the exhaustion, his body's screams for him to stop. He focused only on the back and forth motion, on the transformation of rough wood into a smooth, welcoming surface. When the afternoon sun began to paint the workshop floor with long golden shadows, he finished the last board. He was filthy, covered in sweat and sawdust, and every muscle in his body protested. Alfonso approached, picked up one of the sanded boards, and ran his calloused hand over its surface. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched in an almost imperceptible sign of approval. "For a first day," he said, "it wasn't a complete disaster." Exhausted but feeling a strange, unprecedented kind of satisfaction, Pierce sat on a stool, looking at his raw hands. He hadn't generated wealth, hadn't increased his assets, but he had created something. Something small, but real. That's when he heard the sound of light footsteps behind him. He turned around. Beatrice stood at the entrance of the workshop, the twilight light framing her silhouette. She said nothing. She just walked up to him and, to his surprise, crouched down in front of him. Her eyes didn't seek his. They dropped to his hands, to the blisters, the dirt, and the dried blood. And on her face, for the first time, he saw an emotion he couldn't decipher. It wasn't contempt, nor triumph. It was something far more complex, a silent storm of memories and doubts. Beatrice's hand reached out, but not to help Pierce up. With a surprisingly delicate touch, she grazed her fingers over the popped blisters on his palm. The gesture held no pity, but a kind of forensic curiosity, as if she were examining an artifact from a forgotten world. "I remember my father's hands," she said, her voice low, stripped of the CEO armor, sounding almost like a whisper to herself. "They were like this, always covered in splinters, calluses, and the cuts from his tools. He used to say that every scar was the signature of a piece he had created, proof that he had left a piece of himself in the world." She finally raised her eyes to meet his, and the storm he had seen before now manifested as a deep, visible pain. His greatest fortune wasn't the woodworks, it wasn't the wood, it was those hands. "And your father broke them without ever needing to touch them." Pierce felt the words like a physical blow, stealing his remaining breath. He had understood the story in terms of a broken business, a broken promise, a financial loss. But now he saw the true nature of the theft. It wasn't about money, capital, or a business opportunity. It was about the essence of a man. "After he lost everything," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining a trembling intensity, "well, he never picked up a tool again. The woodworks shut down, the land sold for pennies on the dollar to pay the debts. But the real bankruptcy wasn't that. The real failure was that his joy vanished. That light in his eyes when he looked at a piece of raw mahogany and saw the table it would become. It went out. He found a job as a doorman. He spent his days opening doors for other men, men like your father. And at night, he just sat, looking at his own hands. Now smooth and useless, he didn't die of illness, Pierce. He died of silence. He dissolved little by little because the man who took his dream also took his voice. In that moment, in the dusty workshop, Pierce Sterling finally understood the concept of debt. All his life, he measured value in numbers, bank balances, stock shares, and the dollar quote. Now he faced a debit that no fortune in the world could settle. Antonio's letter was the notice. Beatrice's gaze was the execution. The shame was so overwhelming, so complete, that it emptied him of any desire to defend or justify himself. He was the heir not only to the wealth, but to the sin. Silent tears began to roll down Beatrice's face. They were not tears of anger or triumph. They were of ancient sorrow, the pain of a girl who watched her hero crumble. Seeing her like this, so vulnerable after showing herself to be so unshakable, was the final blow for Pierce. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't have the right. He simply lowered his head and looked at his own injured hands. They were pathetic by comparison. The suffering of a single day against the pain of a lifetime. He rose slowly, feeling the weight of his 30-something years. He walked to the workbench, picked up a fresh piece of sandpaper and one of the boards that still needed work. His movement was the only answer he could give. It was a confession, a penance, an acceptance. Beatrice watched him, the tears stopping as she processed the scene. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was in his awkward, broken way, beginning to work. She stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand, the commander back in control. "I won't buy Titan on Monday," she said, her voice firm again, cutting the workshop silence. Pierce stopped, the sandpaper inches from the wood, and turned to her, his face a mask of confusion and fear. What would she do then? "I have a different plan," Beatrice continued, her eyes fixed on his, unreadable. "One that will honor my father's memory in a way that the mere destruction of your family never could." Monday morning arrived not with a bang, but with a tense silence that hung over the financial market. Everyone expected the final collapse of Titan Investments, the final nail in the coffin of an empire that had fallen apart in public. Reporters clustered in front of the building, waiting for a statement, for a glimpse of Pierce Sterling being escorted out of his own life. But the news that came was not what they expected. In an official statement, released simultaneously to the press and the stock exchange, Beatrice Sampaio's fund announced that not only had it dropped a hostile takeover interest, but it was making a substantial investment in Titan. Not a bailout, the note read, but a strategic recapitalization with a total change of governance and purpose. The market was astonished. The stock, which had plummeted, stopped its freefall and, tentatively, began to recover. No one understood the logic of the move. It was like watching a lion about to strike its prey, suddenly decide to heal its wounds. In the old Titan boardroom, now clean and smelling of new carpet, Beatrice Sampaio sat in the head chair. Facing her were not the former executives, but a new team, handpicked by her and Harrison. On the other side of the table, in an ordinary chair, sat Pierce. He wore simple clothes. His face was tired, but his eyes possessed a clarity they never had before. He was no longer a prisoner awaiting sentence. He was a silent participant in his own transformation. Beatrice addressed the new board. "Titan Investments, as it was known, is dead," she declared, her voice resonating with authority. "Today, the Sampaio Antonio Foundation is born. Our primary focus will no longer be maximizing profits for a small group of shareholders. All the capital and structure of the old Titan will be redirected. Our new business will be to invest in small entrepreneurs, artisans, people like my father, who have a dream and the talent to achieve it, but lack access to capital." She paused, looking at every face in the room. "We won't just offer money. We will offer mentorship, structure, and above all, respect. Our profit will not be measured in dividends, but in the number of businesses we help build, the number of families we sustain. The wealth we generate will be social." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. It was an audacious, almost utopian plan in the heart of Midtown's fierce capitalism. "And as for Pierce Sterling," Beatrice continued, and all eyes turned to him. Pierce felt a chill, prepared for his final fate. He will hold no executive position. He will receive no salary. He has relinquished all his shares and all his inheritance, which now form part of the Foundation's assets. She looked directly at him. His job, should he accept, will be to oversee the mentorship program. He will spend his days not in boardrooms, but in workshops, in small shops, in kitchens. He will sand wood. He will carry boxes. He will listen to the stories of the people his father, and he himself, by extension, would once have ignored. His only payment will be the chance, perhaps one day, to settle a debt that has no price. The offer was, in its essence, a sentence of hard labor, a lifelong penance. But to Pierce, it sounded like the purest and most unexpected form of grace. He didn't need time to think. He looked at Beatrice, and for the first time, he didn't see the executioner of his ruin, but the architect of his redemption. "I accept," he said, his voice firm, without a hint of hesitation. Later, when the room emptied, the two remained alone. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "Why?" Pierce asked, the question consuming him. "You had everything. You could have destroyed me, annihilated my family name forever. Why give me this chance?" Beatrice walked to the window and looked out at the city below. "Because destroying you wouldn't bring my father back," she said, her voice soft. "The revenge is a type of business with a terrible return on emotional investment. It consumes you, turns you into a bitter version of what you hate. My father wasn't a man of revenge. He was a builder, and I realized, in that workshop, that the best way to honor him was not by tearing down your legacy, but by building something new and better on its ruins." She turned to him, a gleam of something like peace in her eyes. "This is my woodworks now, Pierce, and the work is just beginning." 5 years passed. The air of the community workshop, the same one where Pierce Sterling had taken the first painful steps in his new life, was vibrant. The scent of cedar and pine mixed with the constant buzz of saws and the methodical rhythm of hammers. The place had expanded, now occupying the neighboring warehouse, and was the pilot project, the beating heart of the Sampaio Antonio Foundation. Dozens of men and women, young and old, moved with purpose, their hands transforming raw wood into furniture, toys, and hope. They were the new assets, the true net worth of the old Titan investments, a human capital whose value grew with every finished piece. Pierce was at the center of it all, but not as a boss. At 40, his face was leaner, marked by the sun, and his shoulders were broader. He no longer wore suits. He wore canvas overalls stained with glue, similar to Alfonso's, who now smiled more than he spoke. His hands, once soft and useless, were now a map of calluses and scars, tangible proof of his long and silent penance. He was leaning over a workbench, showing a young apprentice how to make a perfect joint, his voice patient, his movements precise. The profit he sought now wasn't in charts, but in the spark of understanding in her eyes. Beatrice arrived without fanfare, as was her custom. She was no longer a constant presence in the workshop, as the foundation had grown exponentially, with projects spread across the country, each one a small fire of hope, fueled by the wealth that had once been used to crush. But she always returned here, to the origin of it all. She stopped at the entrance, watching. She saw Pierce laughing at something the young woman said, and the sound was genuine, light. He was no longer the ghost of his father, nor the arrogant heir. He was just Pierce, a man who had found his worth by emptying himself of everything he thought he was worth. He saw her and nodded, a gesture of respect and camaraderie forged in labor. She approached, running her hand over a newly finished wooden crib, the surface smooth under her fingers. "It's beautiful," she said. "Maria made it," Pierce replied, indicating a smiling woman on the other side of the shop. Single mother of 3. With the foundation's first microloan, she set up a small online shop. Now she employs 2 other women from the neighborhood. Her cash flow is small, but rock solid. He used the old business terms, but with an entirely new meaning. My father would have liked her, Beatrice said, her voice soft, the old pain replaced by a serene melancholy. He would have liked all of this. They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of work around them being the only soundtrack. The debt between them was never verbally forgiven, for it was too great for words, but it had been board by board, sandpaper stroke by sandpaper stroke, transformed into something else. It had been reinvested. The Sterling family's moral liability had become the Sampaio Antonio Foundation's main asset. It was a kind of financial and spiritual alchemy that no one in Midtown could comprehend. The greatest profitability of their lives did not come from stocks or cryptocurrency, but from repair. Beatrice looked at Pierce, at the man he had become, and saw the peace she herself felt. Justice, she finally understood, wasn't about balancing the scales of the past, but about building a fairer future. Her father's legacy was no longer buried under a parking lot, but alive in those hundreds of hands building their own lives. And Pierce Sterling Sr.'s legacy had not been destroyed, but redeemed by his son in a way he could never have imagined. "Keep up the good work, Pierce," she said, a rare and genuine smile touching her lips. He simply nodded, turning back to help another apprentice. The work was the only answer. It was the only prayer.